Section 13 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Anne Boleyn, Chapter 2, Part 2. The season was now at hand when Anne was, in her turn, to experience some of the bitter pangs she had inflicted on her royal mistress. Her agonies were not the less poignant, because conscience must have told her that it was retributive justice which returned the poisoned chalice to her own lips, when she, in like manner, found herself rivalled and supplanted by one of her female attendants, the beautiful Jane Seymour. Jane must have been a person of consummate art, for she was on terms of great familiarity with the king before Anne entertained the slightest suspicion of their proceedings. Entering the room unexpectedly one day, the queen surprised Jane, seated on Henry's knee, receiving his caresses with every appearance of complacency. Struck, as with a mortal blow, at this sight, Anne gave way to a transport of mingled grief and indignation. Henry, dreading his consort's agitation might prove fatal to his hopes of an heir, endeavoured to soothe and reassure her, saying, "Be at peace, sweetheart, and all shall go well for thee." But the cruel shock Anne had sustained brought on the pangs of premature travail, and after some hours of protracted agony, during which her life was in imminent peril, she brought forth a dead son, January 29th. When the king was informed of this misfortune, instead of expressing the slightest sympathy for the sufferings of his luckless consort, he burst into her apartment, and furiously upbraided her with the loss of his boy. Anne, with more spirit than prudence, passionately retorted, that he had no one to blame but himself for this disappointment, which had been caused by her distress of mind about that wench Jane Seymour. Henry sullenly turned away, muttering, as he quitted her apartment, that she should have no more boys by him. These scenes, which occurred in January 1536, may surely be regarded as the first act of the royal matrimonial tragedy, which 4 months later was consummated on Tower Hill. Anne slowly regained her health, but not her spirits. She knew the king's temper too well not to be aware that her influence was at an end for ever, and that she must prepare to resign not only her place in his affections, but also in his state, to the new star by whom she had been eclipsed. When she found that she had no power to obtain the dismissal of her rival from the royal household, she became very melancholy, and withdrew herself from all the gaieties of the court, passing all her time in the most secluded spots of Greenwich Park. It is also related she would sit for hours in the quadrangle court of Greenwich Palace, in silence and abstraction, or seeking a joyless pastime in playing with her little dogs, and setting them to fight with each other. The king had entirely withdrawn himself from her company ever since her rash retort to his unfeeling reproach, and now they never met in private. She had not the consolation of her infant daughter's innocent smiles and endearments to beguile her lonely sorrow, for the Princess Elisabeth was nursed in a separate establishment, and the sweet tie of maternity had been sacrificed to the heartless parade of stately ceremonials. She had alienated the regard and acquired the enmity of her uncle of Norfolk. His royal sister-in-law and early patroness, Mary, Queen of France, was no more, and Suffolk, Henry's principal favourite, was one of her greatest foes. There is reason to believe that the queen had incurred the suspicion and displeasure of her royal husband early in the preceding year, by some mysterious intrigue with the cabinet of her old friend, Francis I, of which we find evidence in a curious dispatch from Gontier, the French ambassador, dated February 5th, 1535, addressed to the Admiral of France, with whom the queen was in correspondence. Gontier tells the admiral that he was introduced into Queen Anne's apartment, where he found the king and the lords and ladies of the court. She talked with him apart on the contents of the admiral's letter, with which she appeared greatly perplexed and dismayed. She complained, says Gontier, of my too long stay, which had engendered in the king, her husband, many doubts and strange thoughts, for which, she said, there was great need that you should devise some remedy on the part of the king her brother, Francis I, or that she was altogether lost and ruined. for she found she was herself in more trouble and annoy than she was before her nuptials, charging me to pray and require, on her part, attention to her affair, of which she could not stay to speak to me so fully as she wished, for fear, both of the place where she then was, and the eyes that were watching her countenance, not only of her said lord and husband, but of his nobles that were there. She told me, that she could neither write to me or see me, nor could she stay with me longer, at which speech she left me to follow her lord, the king, into the next hall, where the dances were forming without the said lady being there. Gontier adds, my lord, this I cannot but know, that she is ill at ease, and I presume to say, on my poor judgment, that the doubts and suspicions of the king, which I mentioned before, have caused her this trouble. A strange scene is here unveiled in Anne Boleyn's queenly life, in which we see her acting her part in terror and perplexity, and confiding to the plenipotentiary of a foreign sovereign her apprehensions lest her royal husband should detect her double feelings. Yet this aside was ventured in the presence of Henry, and before the very courtiers whose observing eyes she dreaded. Such situations are sometimes represented on the stage indeed, but even there appear too highly touched with romance. The inconsistency of Anne Boleyn's manners was, doubtless, the principal cause of her calamities. The lively coquettish maid of honour could not forget her old habits, after her elevation to a throne, and the familiarity of her deportment to those with whom she had formerly been on terms of equality in the court of Queen Catharine encouraged her officers of state to address her with undue freedom. Such was her unbounded thirst for admiration, that even the low-born musician, Mark Smeaton, dared to insinuate his passion to her. These things were, of course, reported to her disadvantage by the household foes by whom she was surrounded. The king's impatience to rid himself of the matrimonial fetters which precluded him from sharing his throne with the object of his new passion would not brook delays, and, in the absence of any proof of the queen's disloyalty to himself, he resolved to proceed against her on the evidence of the invidious gossips' tales that had been whispered to him by persons who knew that he was seeking an occasion to destroy her. 3 gentlemen of the royal household, Brereton, Weston, and Norris, with Mark Smeaton, the musician, were pointed out as her paramours, and as if this had not been enough, the natural and innocent affection that subsisted between Anne and her only brother George, Viscount Rochford, was construed into a presumption of a crime of the most revolting nature. This dreadful accusation proceeded from the hatred and jealousy of Lady Rochford, who, being in all probability an ill-assorted companion for her accomplished husband, regarded his friendship and confidential intercourse with the queen, his sister, with those malignant feelings of displeasure which prompted her murderous denunciation of them both. The secret plot against the queen must have been organized by the first week in April 1536, for on the 4th of that month the parliament was dissolved, as if for the purpose of depriving her of any chance of interference from that body in her behalf. The writs for the new parliament, which was to assemble on the 8th of June, after her death, were issued even before she was arrested, April 27th. 3 days before that date, a secret committee was appointed of the Privy Council to inquire into the charges against her. Among the commissioners were her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, the Duke of Suffolk, the Lord Chancellor, her father, several earls, and some of the judges. It has been supposed that her father did not attend. William Brereton was summoned before this committee on Thursday, the 28th, and after his examination was committed to the Tower. 2 days afterwards the queen, who was totally unconscious of this portentous circumstance, found Mark Smeaton, the musician, standing in the round window of her presence chamber in a melancholy attitude. She asked him, "Why was he so sad?" "It is no matter," he replied. Then the queen had the folly to say, "You may not look to have me speak to you as if you were a nobleman, because you be an inferior person." "No, no, madam," he replied, "a look sufficeth me." There can be little doubt that Mark's sadness was caused by the fearful rumours that must have reached him, of the arrest of Brereton, the proceedings of the queen's enemies in council, and the general aspect of affairs at court, and that he was loitering in the window for the purpose of giving his royal mistress a hint of the peril that threatened her. The absurd vanity, which led her to attribute his troubled looks to a hopeless passion for herself, gave, perhaps, a different turn to the conversation, and diverted him from his purpose. The next day the wretched man was arrested, sent to the Tower, and loaded with irons. If the queen remained in ignorance of what was going on in the palace, as most authors affirm, her powers of observation must have been very limited, and she could have had no faithful friend or counsellor immediately about her. The only reason we have to surmise that Anne was aware of the gathering storm is, that a few days before her arrest, she held a long private conference with her chaplain, Matthew Parker, and gave him a solemn charge concerning the infant princess Elisabeth, it may be supposed regarding her religious education. This fact is authenticated in a letter from Parker to one of Elizabeth's counsellors, declining the archbishopric of Canterbury, in which he says, "Yet he would fain serve his sovereign lady in more respects than his allegiance, since he cannot forget what words her grace's mother said to him not 6 days before her apprehension." On Monday, May 1st, an evil May day for her, Anne Boleyn appeared for the last time in the pride and pomp of royalty, with her treacherous consort, at the jousts at Greenwich. Her brother, Viscount Rochford, was the principal challenger, and Henry Norris was one of the defenders. In the midst of the pageant, which was unusually splendid, the king rose up abruptly and quitted the royal balcony, with a wrathful countenance, attended by but 6 of his confidential followers. Every one was amazed, but the queen appeared especially dismayed, and presently retired. The sports broke up, and Lord Rochford and Henry Norris were arrested at the barrier on the charge of high treason. Sir Francis Weston was taken into custody at the same time. The popular version of the cause of this public outbreak of Henry's displeasure is, that the queen, either by accident or design, dropped her handkerchief from the balcony at the feet of Norris, who, being heated with the course, took it up and presumptuously wiped his face with it. He then handed it to the queen on the point of his lance, at which Henry changed colour, started from his seat, and retired into a transport of jealous fury, and gave the orders for the arrest of the queen and all the parties who had fallen under suspicion of sharing her favours. It is very possible that the circumstances actually occurred as related above, and that Henry, who was anxiously awaiting an opportunity for putting his long meditated project against the queen into execution, eagerly availed himself of the first pretext with which her imprudent disregard of the restraints of royal etiquette furnished him, to strike the blow. Without speaking to the queen, the king rode back to Whitehall, attended by only 6 persons, among whom was his devoted prisoner Norris, who had hitherto stood so high in his favour that he was the only person whom he ever permitted to follow him into his bedchamber. Norris had been, as we have mentioned, one of the 3 witnesses of Henry's secret marriage with Anne. On the way, Henry rode with Norris apart, and earnestly solicited him to obtain mercy for acknowledging his guilt. Norris stoutly maintained his innocence, and that of the queen, nor would he consent to be rendered an instrument in her ruin. When they reached Westminster, he was dispatched to the Tower. The public arrest of her brother and his luckless friends struck a chill to the heart of the queen, but of the nature of their offence, and that she was herself to be involved in the horrible charges against them, she remained in perfect unconsciousness till the following day. She sat down to dinner at the usual hour, but the meal passed over with uneasiness, for she took the alarm when she found that the king's waiter came not with his majesty's wonted compliment, "Of much good may it do you." Instead of this greeting, she observed a portentous silence among her ladies, and that her servants stood about, with their eyes glazed with tears and downcast looks, which inspired her with dismay and strange apprehensions. Scarcely was the surnap removed, when the Duke of Norfolk, with Audley, Cromwell, and others of the lords of the council, entered. At first, Anne thought they came from the king to comfort her for her brother's arrest, but when she noticed the austerity of their countenances, and the ominous presence of Sir William Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, behind them, she started up in terror, and demanded why they came. They replied, with stern brevity, that they came by the king's command to conduct her to the Tower, there to abide during his highness's pleasure. If it be his majesty's pleasure, replied the queen, regaining her firmness, I am ready to obey. And so, pursues our authority, without change of habit or anything necessary for her removal, she committed herself to them, and was by them conducted to her barge. It is, however, certain, from the evidence of Kingston's letters, that she underwent a harsh examination before the council at Greenwich before her embarkation, unless the cruel treatment, which she complained of receiving from her uncle Norfolk on that occasion, took place in the barge, where, it is said, she was scarcely seated ere he entered into the subject of her arrest, by telling her that her paramours had confessed their guilt. She protested her innocence vehemently, and passionately implored to be permitted to see the king, that she might plead her own cause to him. To all her asseverations of innocence the Duke of Norfolk replied with contemptuous ejaculations. It was on the 2nd of May that Anne was brought as a woeful prisoner to her former royal residence, the Tower. Before she passed beneath its fatal arch, she sunk upon her knees, as she had previously done in the barge, and exclaimed, O Lord, help me, as I am guiltless of that whereof I am accused. Then perceiving the lieutenant of the Tower, she said, Mr. Kingston, do I go into a dungeon? No, madam, said he, to your own lodging, where you lay at your coronation. The recollections associated with that event overpowered her, and bursting into a passion of tears, she exclaimed, It is too good for me. Jesus, have mercy on me. She knelt again, weeping apace, and, in the same sorrow, fell into a great laughter more sad than tears. After the hysterical paroxysm had had its sway, she looked wildly about her and cried, Wherefore am I here, Mr. Kingston? The clock was just on the stroke of 5 when Anne entered the Tower. The lords, with the lieutenant, brought her to her chamber, where she again protested her innocence. Then, turning to the lords, she said, I entreat you to beseech the king in my behalf, that he will be good lord unto me. As soon as she had uttered these words, they departed. She desired me, says Kingston, to move the king's highness, that she might have the sacrament in her closet, that she might pray for mercy, asseverating, at the same time, in the strongest terms, her innocence of having wronged the king. I am the king's true wedded wife, she added, and then said, Mr. Kingston, do you know whereof I am here? Nay, replied he. Then she asked, When saw you the king? I saw him not since I saw him in the tilt-yard, said he. Then, Mr. Kingston, I pray you tell me where my lord Rochford is. Kingston answered, I saw him before dinner in the court. Oh, where is my sweet brother? She exclaimed. The lieutenant evasively replied, that he saw him last at York Place, Whitehall Palace, which it seems was the case. I hear say, continued she, that I shall be accused with 3 men, and I can say no more than, nay. O Norris, hast thou accused me? Thou art in the Tower, and thou and I shall die together. And mark, thou art here too? O my mother, thou wilt die for sorrow. Then, breaking off from that subject, she began to lament the dangerous state into which Lady Worcester had been thrown by the shock of hearing of her arrest. Interrupting herself again, she exclaimed, Mr. Kingston, shall I die without justice? The poorest subject the king hath has that, replied the cautious official. A laugh of bitter incredulity was her only comment. The unfortunate queen was subjected to the insulting presence and cruel espionage of her great enemy, Lady Boleyn, and Mrs. Cousins, one of her ladies, who was equally disagreeable to her. These two never left her side by day or night, for they slept on the pallet at the foot of her bed, and reported even the delirious ravings of her hysterical paroxysms to those by whom her fate was to be decided. They perpetually tormented her with insolent observations, and annoyed her with questions, artfully devised, for the purpose of entangling her in her talk, or drawing from her own lips admissions that might be turned into murderous evidence of her guilt. She complained that they would tell her nothing of my lord her father, for whose fate she was evidently apprehensive. She expressed a wish to be served in her prison by the ladies of her privy chamber, whom she favoured most, and concluded by defying her aunt. Lady Boleyn retorted in these words, The desire and partiality you have had for such tale-bearers has brought you to this." Mrs. Cousins impertinently asked the queen why Norris had told her almoner on the preceding Saturday that he could swear the queen was a good woman? "Marry," replied Anne, "I bade him do so, for I asked him why he did not go on with his marriage, and he made answer that he would tarry a while." "Then," said I, "you look for dead man's shoes. If aught but good should come to the king, who was then afflicted with a dangerous ulcer, you would look to have me. He denied it, and I told him I could undo him if I would, and whereupon we fell out." This conversation, if it be really true that Anne had the folly to repeat it to persons whose deadly hatred she was so fully aware, and whom she knew was placed about her as spies, will impress everyone with the idea that she must have been on very perilous terms with Norris, if she allowed him to hold such colloquies with her. No one, however, seems to have considered the possibility of the whole of this deposition being a false statement on the part of the spies who were employed to criminate her. It seems scarcely credible that a woman of Anne Boleyn's age and long experience in public life would commit herself to unnecessary avowals, tending to furnish evidence against herself of having imagined the death of the king, her husband. Anne betrayed a humane, but certainly imprudent care for the comforts of the unhappy gentlemen who were in durance for her sake, by inquiring of Lady Kingston, "Whether anybody made their beds?" "No, I warrant you," was Lady Kingston's familiar reply. The queen said, "that ballads would be made about her," and as far as may be judged from the defaced passages in the manuscript, added, "that none could do better than Wyatt." "Yes," said Lady Kingston, "Master Wyatt, you have said true." The next day Kingston reported the queen's earnest desire to have the Eucharist in her closet, and also to see her almoner. Devitt is the name of him whom she desired, but Cranmer was appointed by Henry. Her mind was variously passioned that day. "One hour," says her gaoler, "she is determined to die, and the next hour much contrary to that. Yesterday," continues he, "I sent for my wife, and also for Mistress Cousins, to know how she had done that day, and they said she had been very merry, and made great dinner, and yet soon after called for her supper, having marvelled where I was all day. At my coming she said, 'Where have you been all day?' I made answer and said, 'I had been with the prisoners.' 'So,' said she, 'I thought I heard Mr. Treasurer.' I assured her he was not here. Then she began to talk and said, 'I was cruelly handled at Greenwich with the king's council, with my lord of Norfolk, who said, "Tut, tut, tut," shaking his head 3 or 4 times. As for my lord treasurer, she said, he was in Windsor Forest all the time. This was her father." Thus in Kingston's letters to Cromwell her minutest sayings are detailed, but it is to be observed that he often speaks from the reports of her pitiless female tormentors. He states, that the queen expressed some apprehension of what Weston might say in his examination, for he had told her on Whit Monday last, that Norris came more into her chamber for her sake than for Madge, one of her maids of honour. By way of postscript, Kingston adds, "Since the making of this letter, the queen spake of Weston, that she had told him he did love her kinswoman Mrs. Skelton, and that he loved not his wife, and he answered her again, that he loved one in her house better than them both. She asked him, 'Who?' To which he replied, 'Yourself,' on which she defied him. When they told her that Smeaton had been laid in irons, she said, 'That was because he was a person of mean birth, and the others were all gentlemen.' She assured Kingston that Smeaton had never been but once in her chamber, and that was when the king was at Winchester, and she sent for him to play on the virginals, for there, said she, my lodging was above the king's." She related also what had passed between her and Smeaton on the Saturday before his arrest. Her passionate love for music, in which she herself greatly excelled, had undoubtedly led her to treat this person with a greater degree of familiarity than was becoming in a queen. There were times when Anne would not believe that Henry intended to harm her, and, after complaining that she was cruelly handled, she added, "But I think the king does it to prove me," and then she laughed, and affected to be very merry. Merriment more sad than tears, reminding us of moody madness, laughing wild, amidst severest woe. Reason must indeed have tottered when she predicted that there would be no reign in England till she was released from her unmerited thraldom. To this wild speech Kingston familiarly rejoined, "I pray then it be shortly, because of the dry weather, you know what I mean." If she had her bishops, they would plead for her, she said. Cranmer, from whom she probably expected most, wrote in the following guarded strain to Henry on the subject. If it be true what is openly reported of the queen's grace, if men had a right estimation of things, they should not esteem any part of your grace's honour to be touched thereby, but her honour only to be clearly disparaged. And I am in such a perplexity that my mind is clean amazed, for I never had a better opinion in woman than I had of her, which maketh me think that she should not be culpable. Now I think that your grace best knoweth that next unto your grace I was most bound unto her of all creatures living. Wherefore I must humbly beseech your grace to suffer me in that which both God's law, nature, and her kindness bindeth me, unto that I may, with your grace's favour, wish and pray for her. And from what condition your grace, of your only mere goodness, took her and set the crown upon her head, I repute him not your grace's faithful servant and subject, nor true to the realm, that would not desire the offence to be without mercy punished, to the example of all others. And as I loved her not a little, for the love I judged her to bear towards God and his holy gospel, so, if she be proved culpable, there is not one that loveth God and his gospel that will ever favour her, but must hate her above all other, and the more they love the gospel, the more they will hate her, for then there never was creature in our time that so much slandered the gospel. And God hath sent her this punishment, for that she feignedly hath professed the gospel in her mouth, and not in her heart and deed. And though she hath offended, so that she hath deserved never to be reconciled to your grace's favour, yet God Almighty hath manifoldly declared his goodness towards your grace, and never offended you. The letter concludes with an exhortation to the king not to think less of the gospel on this account. The letter is dated from Lambeth, May 3rd. Cranmer adds a postscript stating that the Lord Chancellor and others of his Majesty's house had sent for him to the Star Chamber, and there declared such things as the king wished him to be shown, which had made him lament that such faults could be proved on the queen as he had heard from their relation. Anne entreated Kingston to convey a letter from her to Cromwell, but he declined so perilous a service. She was at times like a newly caged eagle in her impatience and despair. The king wist what he did, she said bitterly, when he put such women as my Lady Boleyn and Mrs. Cousins about her. She had 2 other ladies in attendance on her in her doleful prison house, of more compassionate dispositions we may presume, for they were not allowed to have any communication with her, except in the presence of Kingston and his wife, who slept at her chamber door. Her other ladies slept in an apartment further off. One of these, we think, must have been Mary, the sister of her early and devoted friend, Sir Thomas Wyatt. Among the few faithful hearts whose attachment to Anne survived the awful change in her fortunes were those of Wyatt and his sister. Wyatt is supposed to have had a narrow escape from sharing the fate of the queen, her brother, and their fellow victims. It is certain that he was at this period under a cloud, and in one of his sonnets he significantly alludes to the danger which once threatened him in the month of May, the month which proved so fatal to Queen Anne. Very powerful was the sympathy between them, for, even when a guarded captive in the Tower, Anne spake of admiration of Wyatt's poetical talents. It was probably by the aid of his sister that Anne, on the 4th day of her imprisonment, found means to forward the following letter, through Cromwell's agency, to the king. Your grace's displeasure and my imprisonment are things so strange unto me that what to write, or what to excuse, I am altogether ignorant. Whereas you send to me, willing me to confess a truth and so obtain your favour, by such a one, whom you know to be mine ancient professed enemy, I no sooner received this message by him, than I rightly conceived your meaning, And if, as you say, confessing a truth indeed may procure my safety, I shall, with all willingness and duty, perform your command. But let not your grace ever imagine your poor wife will ever be brought to acknowledge a fault, where not so much as a thought ever proceeded. And to speak a truth, never a prince had wife more loyal in all duty, and in all true affection, than you have ever found in Anne Boleyn, with which name and place I could willingly have contented myself if God and your grace's pleasure had so pleased. Neither did I at any time so far forget myself in my exaltation or received queenship, but that I always looked for such alteration as I now find, for the ground of my preferment being on no surer foundation than your grace's fancy, the least alteration was fit and sufficient, I knew, to draw that fancy to some other subject. You have chosen me from a low state to be your queen and companion, far beyond my desert or desire. If then you found me worthy of such honour, good your grace, let not any light fancy or bad counsel of my enemies withdraw your princely favour from me, neither let that stain, that unworthy stain, of a disloyal heart towards your good grace, ever cast so foul a blot on me and on the infant princess your daughter, Elisabeth. Try me, good king, but let me have a lawful trial, and let not my sworn enemies sit as my accusers and as my judges. Yea, let me receive an open trial, for my truth shall fear no open shames. Then shall you see either mine innocence cleared, your suspicions and conscience satisfied, the ignominy and slander of the world stopped, or my guilt openly declared. So that whatever God and you may determine of, your grace may be freed from an open censure, and mine offence being so lawfully proved, your grace may be at liberty, both before God and man, not only to execute worthy punishment on me as an unfaithful wife, but to follow your affection already settled on that party, for whose sake I am now as I am, whose name I could some good, while since have pointed unto, your grace being not ignorant of my suspicion therein. But if you have already determined of me, and that not only my death, but an infamous slander, must bring you to the joying of your desired happiness, then I desire of God that he will pardon your great sin herein, and likewise my enemies, the instruments thereof, and that he will not call you to a straight account for your unprincely and cruel usage of me at his general judgment seat, where both you and myself must shortly appear, and in whose just judgment, I doubt not, whatsoever the world may think of me, mine innocency shall be openly known and sufficiently cleared. My last and only request shall be, that myself may only bear the burden of your grace's displeasure, and that it may not touch the innocent souls of those poor gentlemen, whom, as I understand, are likewise in strait imprisonment for my sake. If ever I have found favour in your sight, if ever the name of Anne Boleyn have been pleasing in your ears, then let me obtain this request, and so I will leave to trouble your grace any further, with mine earnest prayer to the Trinity, to have your grace in his good keeping, and to direct you in all your actions. From my doleful prison in the Tower, the 6th of May, Anne Boleyn. The authenticity of this beautiful letter has been impugned for various reasons, but chiefly because the handwriting differs from the well-known autograph of Anne Boleyn. But the fact that it was found among Cromwell's papers 4 years after her death proves it to be a contemporary document. The cautious but pathetic endorsement to the king from the lady in the Tower identifies it no less than the peculiar nature of the contents as the composition of the captive queen. The original, we may reasonably suppose, had been forwarded to the king by Mr. Secretary Cromwell. The very real objection which occurs to us is, that the letter is signed Anne Boleyn instead of Anna the Queen. It is, however, possible, in the excited state of feeling under which this passionate appeal to the fickle tyrant was written, that his unfortunate consort fondly thought, by using that once beloved signature, to touch a tender chord in his heart. But the time of sentiment, if it ever existed with Henry, was long gone by, and such a letter from a wife whom he had never respected and had now ceased to love was more calculated to awaken wrath than to revive affection. Every word is a sting envenomed by the sense of intolerable wrong. It is written in the tone of a woman who has been falsely accused, and imagining herself strong in the consciousness of her integrity, unveils the guilty motives of her accuser, with a reckless disregard to consequences, perfectly consistent with the character of Anne Boleyn. Her appeal in behalf of the unfortunate gentlemen who were involved in her calamity is generous, and looks like the courage of innocence. A guilty woman would scarcely have dared to allude to the suspected partners of her crime. It is strange that the allusion to the infant Elisabeth in this letter is made without any expression of maternal tenderness. On the 10th of May, an indictment for high treason was found, by the grand jury of Westminster, against the Lady Anne, Queen of England, George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, Henry Norris, Groom of the Stole, Sir Francis Weston and William Brereton, gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, and Mark Smeaton, a performer on musical instruments, a person specified as of low degree, promoted for his skill to be Groom of the Chambers. The 4 commoners were tried in Westminster Hall, May 10th, by a commission of Oyer and Terminer, for the alleged offences against the honour and the life of their sovereign. A true bill had been found against them by the grand juries of 2 counties, Kent as well as Middlesex, because some of the offences specified in the indictment were said to have taken place at Greenwich, others at Hampton Court and elsewhere. Smeaton endeavoured to save his life by pleading guilty to the indictment. He had previously confessed, before the council, the crime with which he and the queen were charged. The 3 gentlemen, Norris, Weston, and Brereton, resolutely maintained their innocence, and that of their royal mistress, though urged by every persuasion, even the promise of mercy, if they would confess. They persisted in their plea, and were all condemned to death. On what evidence they were found guilty no one can now say, for the records of the trial are not in existence. But in that reign of terror, English liberty and English law were empty words. Almost every person whom Henry VIII brought to trial for high treason was condemned, as a matter of course, and at last he omitted the ceremony of trials altogether, and slew his noble and royal victims by act of attainder ad libitum. Every effort was used to obtain evidence against Anne from the condemned prisoners, but in vain. No one, says Sir Edward Bainton, will accuse her, but a lonely Mark, of any actual thing. How Mark's confession was obtained becomes an important question as to the guilt or innocence of the queen. Constantine, whose testimony is anything but favourable to Anne Boleyn, says, that Mark confessed, but it was reported that he had been grievously racked first. According to Grafton, he was beguiled into signing the deposition which criminated himself, the queen, and others, by the subtlety of the admiral, Sir William Fitzwilliam, who, perceiving his hesitation and terror, said, "Subscribe, Mark, and you will see what will come of it." The implied hope of preserving a dishonoured existence prevailed. The wretched creature signed the fatal paper, which proved the death doom of himself as well as his royal mistress. He was hanged that he might tell no tales. Norris was offered his life if he would confess, but declared that he would rather die 1,000 deaths than accuse the queen of that of which he believed her, in his conscience, innocent. When this noble reply was reported to the king, he cried out, "Hang him up then, hang him up!" On the 16th of May, Queen Anne and her brother, Lord Rochford, were brought to trial in a temporary building which had been hastily erected for that purpose within the great hall in the Tower. There were then 53 peers of England, but from this body a select moiety of 26 were named by the king as Lord Triers, under the direction of the Duke of Norfolk, who was created Lord High Steward for the occasion, and sat under the cloth of state. His son, the Earl of Surrey, sat under him as Deputy Earl Marshal. The duke's hostility to his unfortunate niece had already betrayed him into the cruelty of browbeating and insulting her in her examination before the council at Greenwich. It has been erroneously stated by several writers that Anne's father, the Earl of Wiltshire, was one of the Lords Triers, but this was not the case. The Duke of Suffolk, one of her determined enemies, was one of her judges. So also was Henry's natural son, the Duke of Richmond, who had married her beautiful cousin, the Lady Mary Howard, the daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This youth as well as Suffolk, as a matter of course, voted according to the king's pleasure. The Earl of Northumberland, Anne's first lover, was named on the commission for her trial. He appeared in his place, but was taken suddenly ill, the effect, no doubt, of violent agitation, and quitted the court before the arraignment of the Lord Rochford, which preceded that of the queen. He died a few months afterwards. Lady Rochford outraged all decency by appearing as a witness against her husband. The only evidence adduced in proof of the crime with which he was charged was, that one day, when making some request to his sister the queen, he leaned over her bed, and was said by the bystanders to have kissed her. He defended himself with great spirit and eloquence, so that his judges were at first divided, and had the whole body of the peers been present, he might have had a chance of acquittal. But as we have shown, the Lords Triers were a number selected by the crown for this service. The trial was conducted within strong walls, the jurors were picked men, and by their verdict the noble prisoner was found guilty. After he was removed, Anne, Queen of England, was called into court by a gentleman usher. She appeared immediately in answer to the summons, attended by her ladies and Lady Kingston, and was led to the bar by the lieutenant and the constable of the Tower. The royal prisoner had neither counsel nor adviser of any kind, but she had rallied all the energies of her mind to meet the awful crisis. Neither female terror nor hysterical agitation were perceptible in that hour. The Lord of Milherve tells us that she presented herself at the bar with the true dignity of a queen, and curtsied to her judges, looking round upon them all without any sign of fear. Neither does it appear that there was anything like parade or attempt at theatrical effect in her manner, for her deportment was modest and cheerful. When the indictment was read, which charged her with such offences as never Christian queen had been arraigned for before, she held up her hand courageously, and pleaded "Not guilty." She then seated herself in the chair which had been provided for her use while the evidence against her was stated. Of what nature the evidence was, no one can now form an opinion, for the records of the trial have been carefully destroyed. Burnet affirms that he took great pains in searching for documents calculated to throw some light on the proceedings, and the chief result of his labours was an entry made by Sir John Spelman, in his private notebook, supposed to have been written on the bench, when he sat as one of the judges before whom Norris, Weston, Brereton, and Smeaton were tried for the alleged offences, in which they had been, as it was said, participators with the queen. These are the words quoted by Burnet. As for the evidence of the matter, it was discovered by the Lady Wingfield, who had been a servant to the queen, and, becoming suddenly infirm before her death, did swear this matter to one of her. Here the page containing the important fact communicated by the dying lady is torn off, and with it all the other notes the learned judge had made on these mysterious trials were destroyed, so that, as Burnet has observed, the main evidence brought against the queen and her supposed paramours was the oath of a dead woman, and that, we may add, on hearsay evidence. Crispin's account of the origin of the charge is, that a gentleman reproving his sister for the freedom of her behaviour, she excused herself by alleging the example of the queen, who was accustomed, she said, to admit Sir Henry Norris, Sir Francis Weston, Master Brereton, Mark Smeaton the musician, and her brother Lord Rochford, into her chamber at improper hours, adding, that Smeaton could tell a great deal more. The crimes of which the queen was arraigned were, that she had wronged the king her husband at various times, with the 4 persons above named, and also with her brother Lord Rochford; that she had said to each and every one of those persons that the king never had her heart; that she privately told each, separately, that she loved him better than any person in the world, which things tended to the slander of her issue by the king. To this was added a charge of conspiring against the king's life. In an abstract from the indictment printed in the notes of Sharon Turner's Henry VIII., The days on which the alleged offences were committed are specified. The first is with Norris, and is dated October 6, 1533, within a month after the birth of the Princess Elizabeth, which statement brings its own refutation, for the queen had not then quitted her lying-in chamber. "For evidence," says Wyatt, "as I never could hear of any, small I believe it was. The accusers must have doubted whether their proofs would not prove their reproofs, when they durst not bring them to the light in an open place." Every right-thinking man must indeed doubt the truth of accusations which cannot be substantiated according to the usual forms of justice. The queen defended her own cause with ready wit and great eloquence. Wyatt says, "It was reported without the doors, that she had cleared herself in a most wise and noble speech." Another of the floating rumours that were in circulation among the people, before the event of her trial was publicly known, was, that having a quick wit and being a ready speaker, the queen did so answer all objections, that her acquittal was expected. And, says Bishop Godwin, had the peers given their verdict according to the expectation of the assembly, she had been acquitted, but through the Duke of Suffolk, one wholly given to the king's humour, they did pronounce her guilty. The decision of the peers was not required, like the verdict of a jury, to be unanimous, but is carried by a majority. If all had voted, no doubt she would have been saved. After the verdict was declared, the queen was required to lay aside her crown and other insignia of royalty, which she did without offering any objection, save that she protested her innocence of having offended against the king. This ceremony was preparatory to her sentence, which was pronounced by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, as Lord High Steward of England and President of the Court Commission for her trial. She was condemned to be burnt or beheaded at the king's pleasure. Anne Boleyn heard this dreadful doom without changing colour or betraying the slightest symptom of terror, but when her stern kinsman and judge had ended, she clasped her hands, and raising her eyes to heaven, made her appeal to a higher tribunal in these words: "O Father, O Creator, thou who art the way, the life, and the truth, knowest whether I have deserved this death." Then, turning to her earthly judges, she said, "My lords, I will not say your sentence is unjust, nor presume that my reasons can prevail against your convictions. I am willing to believe that you have sufficient reasons for what you have done, but then they must be other than those which have been produced in court, for I am clear of all offences which you then laid to my charge. I have ever been a faithful wife to the king, though I do not say I have always shown him that humility which his goodness to me and the honour to which he raised me merited. I confess I had jealous fancies and suspicions of him, which I had not discretion and wisdom enough to conceal at all times. But God knows, and is my witness, that I never sinned against him in any other way. Think not I say this in the hope to prolong my life. God hath taught me how to die, and he will strengthen my faith. Think not that I am so bewildered in mind as not to lay the honour of my chastity to heart, now in mine extremity, when I have maintained it all my life long, as much as ever queen did. I know these my last words will avail me nothing, but for the justification of my chastity and honour. As for my brother and those others who are unjustly condemned, I will willingly suffer many deaths to deliver them. But, since I see it so pleases the king, I shall willingly accompany them in death, with this assurance, that I shall lead an endless life with them in peace." Then, with a composed air, she rose up, made a parting salutation to her judges, and left the court as she had entered it. Such is the graphic account that has been preserved of Anne Boleyn's looks, words, and demeanour on this trying occasion, by a foreign contemporary, who was one of the few spectators who were permitted to witness it. The Lord Mayor, who was present at the arraignment of Anne Boleyn, said afterwards that he could not observe anything in the proceedings against her that they were resolved to make an occasion to get rid of her. As the chief judge in the civic court of judicature, and previously as an alderman of the city of London, this magistrate had been accustomed to weigh evidences and pronounce judgments on criminal causes, therefore his opinion is of importance in this case. Camden tells us that spectators deemed Anne innocent, and merely circumvented. This accords with the lord mayor's opinion. Smeaton was not confronted with her, and, as far as can be gathered of the grounds of her condemnation, it must have been on his confession only. It is said she objected, that one witness was not enough to convict a person of high treason, but was told, that in her case it was sufficient. In these days, the queen would have had the liberty of cross-questioning the witnesses against her, either personally or by fearless and skilful advocates. Moreover, it would have been in her power to have summoned even her late attendant, Mistress Jane Seymour, as one of her witnesses. The result of that lady's examination might have elicited some curious facts. After her trial, Anne was conveyed back to her chamber, the Lady Boleyn, her aunt, and Lady Kingston only attending her. On the 16th of May, Kingston wrote on the following methodical style to Cromwell, on the subject of the dreadful preparations for the execution of the death-doomed queen and her brother. Sir, this day I was with the king's grace, and declared the petitions of my lord of Rochford, wherein I was answered. Sir, the said lord much desireth to speak with you, which toucheth his conscience much, as he saith, wherein I pray you that I may know your pleasure, for because of my promise made unto my said lord to do the same. And also I shall desire you further to know the king's pleasure touching the queen, as well as for her comfort, as for the preparations of scaffolds and other necessaries concerning. The king's grace showed me that my lord of Canterbury shall be her confessor, and he was here this day with the queen. And note that in that matter, sir, the time is short, for the king supposeth the gentleman to die tomorrow, and my lord Rochford, with the rest of the gentlemen, are yet without confession, which I look for, but I have told my lord Rochford that he be in a readiness tomorrow to suffer execution, and so he accepts it very well, and will do his best to be ready. The same day on which this letter was written, the king signed the death warrant of his once passionately loved consort, and sent Cranmer to receive her last confession. Anne appeared to derive comfort and hope from the primate's visit, hope even of life, for she told those about her that she understood she was to be banished, and she supposed she should be sent to Antwerp. Cranmer was aware of Henry's wish of dissolving the marriage with Anne Boleyn, in order to dispossess the little princess Elisabeth of the place she had been given in the succession, and he had probably persuaded the unfortunate queen not to oppose his majesty's pleasure in that matter. The flattering idea of a reprieve from death must have been suggested to Anne, in order to induce her compliance with a measure so repugnant to her natural disposition and her present frame of mind. When she was brought as a guarded prisoner from Greenwich to the Tower, she had told the unfriendly spectators of her disgrace, that they could not prevent her from dying their queen, accompanying these proud words with a haughty gesticulation of her neck. Yet we find her, only the day after her conference with the archbishop, submitting to resign this dearly prized and fatally purchased dignity without a struggle. End of Section 13.